Добър вечер и добре дошли на всички. Изключително сме щастливи, че сте тук. Това е 12-та поредна мемориална лекция в памет на Джу. И преди да представя нашият лектор, ще си позволя да ви напомня за тази лекция, тъй като виждам хора, които навярвам преди 12 години, са били по 12 години, така че те няма как да познават нашата колежка Юлия Гурковска Джу, в памет на която е тази лекция. Но за Центъра за либерални стратегии това е може би най-важното събитие, което ние правим годишно, тъй като в голяма степен за самия център, за хората, които работят там, нейното присъствие е от изключително значение, дори 12 години след като вече няма. И затова ние решихме да направим такава лекция, в която всяка година поканим някой, който, независимо от това на каква тема говори, независимо от това каква е неговата специалност, но това трябва да бъде една лекция, която тя би искала да чуе. И затова мисля, че за нас и тази 12-та лекция е особено важна, тъй като лектора, който сме поканили сега, мисля, че е лектор, който Джу щеше да бъде изключително щастлива да чуе. Темата, по която ще говори, според мен е тема, която е изключително важна за нея. Сnyder е историк, професор в Yale. Обикновено на такива представения винаги се казва един от най-интересните, изключително важна фигура. Поне за мен, поне в рамките на своето поколение, може би най-интересният историк на Европа сега. Навярвам, повечето от вас познават поне някои от неговите книги. Bloodlands се превърна в бестселър и благодарение на Красен Станчев и други колеги дори започна подписка със събиране на пари за нейния превод. Книгата му "Червения принц" е също според мен една от абсолютно бляскавите книги, разказваща по съвсем различен начин историята на 20 век, под начина, по който обикновено се опитваме да го слушаме. И затова, когато ние се опитвахме да решим кого да поканим, за да може да напомним за всеки от вас с толкова интересна фигура, каквато беше Джу, пътешественик, изключително светъл човек, невероятно присъствие, невероятно любопитство към живота, решихме, че човекът, който най-добре ще може да отговори на тези очаквания е Тим. Аз съм изключително благодарен за него, за това, че намери време да дойде. Освен, че е професор в Yale, той е изследовател в Института за науките за човека в Виена. Така че в рамките на тази една година имах удоволствието да видя много от това, което той прави. И за това съм изключително щастлив да му дам думата. Това, което го отличава като историк, е, че някои от най-бляскавите историци обичат да не напускат периода, който познават най-добре. Всъщност много често историците приличат на хора, които са избрали да се занимават с история, защото нямат интерес да живеят в собственото си време. В този смисъл има много различен. За него по-скоро историята е начин да живее в собственото си време и огромно удоволствие да му дам думата.
Yeah. I don't think this is on. Is it? How can you hear me when I can't hear me? It's a great pleasure to be in your company here. It's a great pleasure to be included in the list of memorial speakers. Because this is a memorial lecture, it's caused me to think not just about my subject, which is a historical subject, but also about the nature of history itself. I've been thinking a good deal in the context of recent events in Ukraine and in the context of propaganda about these events, about what history actually is, what history means to us, what is good history, and what is bad history. So, in these remarks tonight, I'm going to be telling you a story. I'm going to be telling you a history of Ukraine and a history of Europe. but I'm also going to be thinking aloud with you about what history is, what functions it serves, and what functions it can be made to serve. So, as I'm telling you this history, I'm going to be thinking about history as a story, but also history as a project. So, when we become aware of ourselves as historical actors, as members of a nation, for example, we not only accept a history, but we believe that we're part of the history. And then history is not only a past, history is also a future. Because when you're part of a larger community, a national community, a European community, you think of the past as leading through you into some kind of a future. History is part of your own life is part of history. And of course, history is also a matter of lessons. As we think about the 20th century or about earlier history, we draw lessons from it. We make comparisons to the present day. We try to decide what we can learn from the past. So as I tell you this story, I'm also going to be reflecting upon these purposes of history. And I'm going to close by asking, what kind of a historical turning point are we at? Because I'm sure that we are at a historical turning point for Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe, and also for you. And I think the nature of this historical turning point actually has very much to do with how we think about history, or how we choose to think about history, or about how we will think about history in the days and weeks and months to come. Okay. So let me begin then in a very conventional way, with a very straightforward history. The very straightforward and simple history of Ukraine, or the lands of Ukraine in Europe. Much of the history of Ukraine will sound familiar to you. It's a history of Slavs. It's a history of people who regarded themselves as people of the Word. It's a history of encounters with Byzantium, romantic encounters, military encounters, like the history of Bulgaria in all these ways. Also like the history of Bulgaria in that it's a history of hesitation about conversion to Christianity, hesitation between East and West before a final decision was made in Ukraine or in Rus, Ruthenia, around the year 988. Interestingly, the history of Bulgaria and Ukraine have more in common, though, than just these comparisons. In a way, Ukraine, and again, you all know this, in a way, Ukraine is part of a history that passes through Bulgaria. The history that you know much better than me of Cyril and Methodius, of the creation of a written Slavic language, of the creation of the alphabet after Cyril's death, known as Cyrillic. This was part of a civilizational package, these words, these letters, which one still sees from Sofia, to Siberia. And this civilizational package takes on a very interesting form precisely in Kiev and Rus, in the medieval state of Kiev and Rus. These letters and these words are used in Kiev after the conversion, and they're used in not just as a language of religion, but also as a language of law. Kiev and Rus had its own law codes. And the interesting thing about these law codes is that they survive for another 600 years. So law for Kiev and Rus then is taken over in the 13th and 14th centuries by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then continues to function in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, all the way into the 17th and even the 18th centuries. So there's a continuity in civilization from Cyril and Methodius through Kiev, through Vilnius, and even to Warsaw, which lasts 600 or 700 years. Now, this is interesting to us for a couple of reasons. The first is that I want to be able to stress a certain kind of continuity. the history of Ukraine is often discussed or perceived as a history of discontinuity, or even as a history of non-existence. In fact, in terms of civilization and culture, Kiev is actually a place of continuity rather than discontinuity. The East Slavic culture, especially in law and politics, has more continuity, one could argue, in Kiev than anywhere else. And the second reason this is interesting for us is that this is a continuity which stretches from east back to west. So we have a certain tendency of thinking there's Eastern Slavic civilization and Western Slavic, or even Eastern European and Western European. And we have a certain tendency also to think that if something happened in Kiev, it was most relevant then for Moscow. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, this wasn't true. The lands of Kiev and Rus were incorporated by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania became part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So this civilization and this polity survived all the way until 1795 in one form or another. This East Slavic civilizational package entered into a very West European world, a world of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in which there was a Renaissance, in which there was a Reformation, in which there was a Counter-Reformation. So the history of Ukraine has a very interesting feature that it is both indisputably Eastern, right? It comes from Cyril and Methodius through Bulgaria, but it is also indisputably Western in that it encountered all of the major trends of West European history all the way until the 19th century. Now, this brings me to the 19th century. And here I want to think for a moment about history as subjectivity, history as a way that we believe we're taking part in the world along with other people. In other words, history as a national movement. The way that history changes, or the way that we think about history changes in the 19th century, because rather than being a matter simply of kings or martyrs or chronicles, history becomes a question of whole peoples. And history writing, whether it's professional history writing, whether it's the invention of myths and fairy tales, whether it's poetry, all involves an attempt to bring some larger group together into an elite in the name of the creation of a nation. So this is an example, a very important example of history as subjectivity. Now, how does this happen in Ukraine? On the one hand, it is very typically European. Like the Balkans, like Poland, like Germany, like the Habsburg monarchy, the creation of history as national history involves a form of romanticism. It involves imagining a past in which everyone in a certain territory in some way took part in history, in some way took part in politics together. In Ukraine, this trend was known as populism. In Russia too, for that matter. And it involved history writers who took the focus from history away from the state and put the focus of history on the common people, right? The most important of these was Hrushevsky. Hrushevsky, by the way, is a very interesting example of how this works, because as in all romanticisms and as in all populisms, what you have is the elite trying to bring the masses into a history, right? So Hrushevsky is the great populist Ukrainian historian, indisputably so, much loved to this day. A huge statue of him in Kiev. He was president of the first Ukrainian Republic, a very important figure. And Hrushevsky's mother spoke Polish and his father spoke Russian, right? His father was a Russian imperial bureaucrat. His mother was of Polish noble origin. This is what Romanticism, populism is all about. Elites trying to bring masses into history. But that's totally normal. You find that everywhere. What's a bit special about the Ukrainian national moment, what's a bit special about Ukrainian populism, is that it had multiple enemies at the same time. So it's very convenient, if you were a romantic poet, or a populist historian if you only have one enemy. That is, if the government is controlled by the same people who own the land. The predicament of Ukraine was that there were two enemies. If you read Ukrainian populist history, if you read Ukrainian romantic poetry, and here the great figures, of course, Taras Shevchenko, the most immediate enemy is not the Russian Empire. The most immediate enemy are the Poles, the Polish aristocrats, the Polish magnates, the Poles who actually own the land. In the 19th century, from the point of view of Ukrainian peasants wishing to be free, or more importantly, wishing to own land, Polish aristocrats were much more important than the distant Russian Empire. Now, I stress this problem because over the course of the lecture, we're going to see how it's resolved. In the 19th century, a Ukrainian national movement is challenged both by a distant Russian Empire, which comes closer and closer and closer and eventually bans the Ukrainian language, and by Polish landholders, who are usually the actual local oppressors of the Ukrainian population. And to make matters more complicated still, the territory that's now Ukraine wasn't part of one empire. I mean, this is the way in which Ukrainian history is very different from Bulgarian history. In Bulgarian history, in the 19th century, there is one empire that matters a lot, the Ottoman Empire. And the other empires are outside players. In the history of Ukraine, most of the territory is part of the Russian Empire, but some of the territory is part of the Habsburg monarchy. Right? So this makes things complicated. And the way it works out in practice, intellectually, is that the Ukrainian national idea starts in Kharkiv, or Kharkov for you Russian speakers out there. It starts in Kharkiv, and then moves to Kiev, and then finally, at the end of the 19th century, takes refuge in Lviv, in what's now Western Ukraine. And this is very important to stress, because we have a certain tendency to think that the Ukrainian idea came from the West, which is simply not true. The Ukrainian idea came from Kharkiv. The Ukrainian idea came from Russian populism. It came from educational institutions in eastern Ukraine, and then spread westward. It survived in Lviv because conditions in the Habsburg monarchy were more favorable. There was liberalism, and there was a kind of democracy. Now, this brings us to the 20th century, and to a very decisive moment of, let's say, 1912 to 1922, the period of the Balkan Wars, the First World War, the Russian Civil War, the creation of the Soviet Union. That decade from 1912 to 1922, did I mention the First World War, is a crucial period. It's the moment of the end of conventional empires, the establishment of new nation states, the enlargement or the reduction of some nation states that already existed, and it's also the moment in 1922 of the creation of the Soviet Union. Now, in Ukraine, or the territories that are now Ukraine, something very unusual happens, something which is worth stressing, something which is worth understanding. In general, in that period between 1912 and 1922, it didn't really matter whether you fought. And I'm sorry to say this because it's a kind of challenge to most national historiographies and myths, but in general there is no correlation between whether you fought for a nation state and whether you got it. Some people fought for it and got it. Some people didn't fight for it and got it anyway. I noticed some guilty laughter. Some people fought for it and did not get it, right? Which is what's interesting about, that's precisely what's interesting about the Ukrainian case. In the Ukrainian case, as the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, as the First World War came to an end, as the Germans withdrew from Eastern Europe, you have two struggles to create a Ukrainian state, one centered in the West and one centered in Kiev. And both of them fought long and complicated wars. Both of them took not thousands, but tens of thousands of mortal casualties, right? Both of them inflicted not thousands, but tens of thousands of mortal casualties. Both of them killed lots of civilians along the way, which is what happens. But my point is, there was a tremendous amount of bloodshed in Ukraine in this period, which did not generate a national state, right? So we like to think national liberation struggles are connected with national liberation, but they're not, really. They're not usually. The correlation is just not there. So if we're tempted to think that Ukraine doesn't have a history because no one fought for Ukrainian independence, it's simply not true. Far more people fought for it than fought for Czechoslovakia. Far more people fought for it than fought for Hungary or Romania, for that matter, Bulgaria, at the same time. But they were overcome. They were overcome by forces which were greater than themselves. They were overcome in the West by a Polish army, and they were overcome in the East and Center by the White Army, that is, Russian conservatives, and the Red Army. They were facing not one, not two, but three major military forces which did not believe in Ukrainian state. And again, I'm stressing this point of multiple enemies because it's interesting to see how this is going to turn out. The Poles, the White Army, and the Red Army had very few things in common. But one of the things they had in common was that they were not in favor of a Ukrainian state, at least not a Ukrainian state that wasn't friendly to their own interests. So at the end of this tremendously complicated period of civil war by 1922, you have Ukrainian territories again divided. Most of them inside the Soviet Union, some of them inside Poland. And here's where things, in my mind, become truly interesting. I mean, apart from the importance of Ukrainian history to all of us now, it's also just incredibly interesting. The Soviet Republic of Ukraine is in some sense in the middle of the Soviet project. It's the crucial part of the Soviet project. It's the most sensitive part of the Soviet project. Why is that so? Because the Soviet project was about Europe. It was about loving Europe and hating Europe, which is presumably a sentiment which we can all identify with, right? It was about loving Europe in the sense that Europe was an example of what modern capitalism looked like. And the Soviet project was to turn a backward agrarian country into an industrial modern country. In other words, to catch up to the capitalists. In this sense, Europe was a model, and a model has to be good. On the other hand, the idea was to surpass Europe, to defeat the capitalists, to overcome them, and eventually to destroy them, and hopefully humiliate them along the way. So, in this sense, Europe was a negative example. Now, this tension is built into the entire Soviet experience. Whenever you were imitating someone in order to do better than them, and then destroy them, there's a certain tension involved. If you're a younger sibling, you may know what I have in mind. You're a younger sibling. So the point is that in this Soviet project, Ukraine is special. It's special because, for two reasons. The first is that it is actually on the border of Europe. Right? It has a long border with Poland and a long border with Romania. So it's physically on the western frontier of the Soviet Union. Europe is not a metaphor, Europe is an actual neighbor. The second reason it's so sensitive is that the Soviet project of modernization, of industrialization, depends particularly on the exploitation of Ukrainian black earth, of Ukrainian agricultural potential. So to make the Soviet Union modern, you have to be able to control Ukraine. You have to master the Ukrainian soil. And here's where the problems begin in the late 1920s and early 1930s. They begin in culture, and then they continue in economics. And it's very interesting how the two come together. The way that the Soviet Union governed Ukrainian culture in the 1920s was to encourage Europe. Ukrainian, if any of you know Ukrainian literary history or artistic history, you'll know that the 1920s are a period of an explosive modernism, right? Even futurism, which is actually not bad, pretty interesting, in Ukrainian culture. There has never been a decade in Ukrainian literary or artistic history which is so interesting as the 1920s. Why? Because of Soviet subsidies, because of Soviet support. The idea was, if you bring Ukrainian culture closer to Europe, closer to the universal ideas that are associated with Europe, then you're also bringing it closer to modernity, to revolution, and to the Soviet Union. But by the late 1920s, the Soviet leadership began to have some doubts about all of this. Ukrainian writers began to speak rather positively about Europe as a countermodel to Russia, as a countermodel to the Soviet Union. Some of them began to speak positively about Poland as a countermodel to Russia. Very dangerous. Meanwhile, at exactly the same time, collectivization begins. The collectivization of agriculture, the attempt to put what had been private farmland under state control. And in Ukraine, where the strongest theme, really, in history is the desire of peasants to control their own land, this attempt at collectivization was greeted as a second serfdom. I'm now quoting how the peasants talked about it. As a second serfdom, as the arrival of the devil on earth, as a cataclysm, right? As an apocalypse. This was something which these people who were religious believers, as many of you will know, Orthodox Christianity is much more deeply entrenched in Ukraine than it is in Russia. But people who were Orthodox believers and people who cared very much about private property found that their private property was being taken away from them. And they reached for these catastrophic comparisons, and they resisted. So the NKVD, the Soviet secret state police, recorded 1 million acts of resistance between January and March 1930. 1 million acts of resistance by peasants to collectivization. So this is a crucial moment in how the Soviet leadership, and in particular how Joseph Stalin, who at this very moment is coming to power, consolidating power, treat Europe. This is the moment of axis. This is the turning point where Europe ceases to be a kind of model and becomes more a threat. Because the failure of collectivization, as I'm sure you all know, leads to famine. In this famine in the Soviet Union, something like 7 million people starve to death or die of associated diseases. And in Soviet Ukraine in particular, something like 3.5 million people die. And this famine has to have a cause. And the cause can't be the Soviet project. It can't be Comrade Stalin. It can't be collectivization. It has to be something else. So the way that Stalin plays this, very intelligently, is that he says that the famine is a result of Ukrainian nationalists who have penetrated the party. The famine is a result of the instructions of the Polish secret services who are supposedly very active in Ukraine. And then afterwards, anyone who talks about the famine, beginning in 1933, 34, anyone who talks about the famine is an agent of the German secret services. Right? So Europe is becoming, instead of a general universal model of development, Europe is becoming a source of threats and conspiracies against the homeland of socialism. Now, this is part of the story of the history of Ukraine, but it's also a lesson. I want you to notice the lesson. Because what happens in 1930 is very similar, I think hauntingly similar, to what happens in November and December 2013. In other words, you move very quickly from seeing Ukraine as something which is close to Russia, friendly to Russia, unthreatening, to Ukraine as something which is penetrated by Europe, penetrated by decadent Europe, penetrated by capitalist Europe, perhaps losing your control. This notion that Ukraine is close to Europe and that this might be good, but it also might be bad, is a continuing theme. Now, here we then have the moment, beginning in 1933, where the history of Ukraine, in my view, is truly special, is truly unusual. How is this the case? In general, the history of Europe, if you'll permit me just a big digression here, the history of Europe is a history in which the main theme is decolonization. So, from the point of view of the Balkans or of Poland, it is self-decolonization.
right? You're getting rid of empires. From the point of view of Western Europe, Britain and France, it's a history of decolonization in that you lose your far-flung empires, right? The big theme of 20th century European history is decolonization. Ukraine is the major exception to this. In Ukraine, in the middle of the 20th century, the main theme is precisely colonization, and a double colonization. The first colonization, as formulated by Joseph Stalin, is internal colonization. As Comrade Stalin himself described it, since we do not have overseas colonies, like the capitalist powers, we must colonize ourselves. And of course, Ukraine is the most important internal colony because Ukraine has the richest agricultural soil. Meanwhile, from the point of view of Adolf Hitler, Ukraine is also the center of a colonization project. The word Lebensraum means, above all, in geographical terms, Ukraine. The central idea of the Nazi colonization project was, if we can control the black earth of Ukraine, then we will become self-sufficient. We can become a world power. The Nazis actually planned to do on purpose what the Stalinists had done by accident. That is, they planned to use the collective farm to starve not 3 million people, as had already happened, but 30 million people. In the fall of 1941, and this is in black and white, this is a plan. 30 million inhabitants of the Soviet Union were to be starved to death as the Germans redirected Ukrainian food supplies to themselves and to Western Europe. Now, this is important because Ukraine has a very special history, I think, in the 20th century as a European colony, and more special still because it's a double colony. There is no other place in Europe, no other territory, which was so central to the planning of intra-European colonial powers. Now, what follows from this, and I can't tell you the whole story. It's the history that I write about in my book Bloodlands. But as a result of this, Ukraine is the most dangerous place in the world between 1933 and 1945. More people are killed as a matter of policy on the territory of today's Ukraine than in any other country in the world in that period. And this is a result of the overlap of these projects. Now, the overlap of these projects could be hostile, right? As in 1941, when Germany makes war on the Soviet Union. That is a war for Ukraine. Above all, it's a war for Ukraine, as Stalin himself understood. And so the overlap could be one of hostility, but it could also be one of alliance. There's an earlier period, which we often overlook, the period of 1939 to 1941, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were allies. And without going into all of the details of this, there's a very interesting implication of this. The Molotov-Ribbentrop period, the period of 1939 to 1941, is not a period where Stalin was just making mistakes. I mean, we tend to look at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and say, how could Stalin have made an alliance with Hitler? He should have known Hitler was going to attack. Stalin knew that Hitler was going to attack. The thing that he got wrong was the year. He thought it was going to be 1942. It turned out to be 1941. Anyone could have made that mistake. So let's be more sympathetic to Comrade Stalin. The crucial thing here is what Stalin thought he was doing, because this is another lesson from the very recent past, which we overlook at our peril. When Stalin made an alliance with Hitler in 1939, what he thought he was doing was turning Germany against France and Britain. Right? What he thought he was doing was making sure that there was no German-Soviet conflict, but instead that German aggression and military force would be turned against France and Britain. And this would lead to a situation, again now I quote Comrade Stalin, in which the contradictions of capitalism would reveal themselves, the Western power and the Western powers would collapse. Now, think again about what he's doing. He is trying to use the European far right to destroy Western Europe. And it very nearly succeeded, by the way. It wasn't such a bad gambit. If France hadn't fallen so quickly, it might well have worked. And France shouldn't have fallen so quickly, by the way. So this idea of using the European far right to destroy European structures is a certain lesson of history. And again, it is literally a lesson. I mean, you and I can choose not to notice it. We can choose not to draw this lesson. But it is a matter of precedent for Russian policy today. Russian policy today seeks to use the European far right to destroy Western Europe, as we know, that is to say what we now call the European Union. Now, how does this come to an end? What happens so that we can begin to speak about a European history for Ukraine? The way that Ukraine becomes a subject in its own history is very interesting. Now, I forgot. This is terrible for the translator, sorry. I forgot an important point. Another thing that comes from Ukraine as a colonized country, something that makes it very difficult for Europeans to understand, and I think this is true in Bulgaria just as it's true in Germany or France. Ukrainian nationalism is anti-colonial. Above all things, it's anti-colonial. Before all things, it's anti-colonial. In this way, it's much more like Latin American nationalism or African nationalism than it's like French or German nationalism, or I think even Bulgarian nationalism. It's anti-colonial from recent colonial experience. And we have a hard time categorizing that. When we see people who are willing to fight against something, we generally think they have some internal disorder. They must be ethnic nationalists, or they must be racists, or they must not understand the importance of pacifism, or they must not have learned the lessons of European history. But from the point of view of Ukrainians, and this is all over the country now, the history of the 20th century is a history of colonization, which means that national self-assertion has to be anti-colonial. There's a source of national politics here which we either have forgotten or which we find very distant. Okay, so given that that's the case, how do we get from a Ukraine that is a colonial object to a Ukraine that is something like a political subject? Here, the crucial decade is the 1970s. Now, in general, when you start history with the 1970s, people get very bored very quickly. And what I want to insist is that to understand what is happening in Ukraine right now, more important than any other period is the 1970s. The 1970s are the time when the intellectual frameworks for what's happening now were worked out. In the 1970s, there were two rival projects of integration which were taking form. And I would argue that those two rival projects are basically the projects that we have now. One project was the non-utopian Soviet Union. So for most of the history of Ukraine, the story was supposed to be Ukrainians become Soviets, and then you get utopia, right? At the end of it, you get communism, you get something very good. By the 1970s, that story was simpler. It was simply Ukrainians become Soviets, right? There was no utopia promised anymore. There was really existing socialism, which already existed, really. So Ukrainians were to become Soviets. How did this work in practice? In the 1970s, Ukrainian language textbooks disappeared from schools. The ideology was of one Soviet technical and humanist intelligentsia, which is to say one Russophone technical and humanist intelligentsia. So de facto educated people from Kiev or Kharkiv or Luhansk or what have you went to Moscow. That was the direction of social advancement. So you have this project. You have this project of integration. At the same time, the European project was taking shape. Taking shape not just in Western Europe, but taking shape as a kind of idea in Eastern Europe as well. This notion of a return to Europe, right, begins to take shape. Some people in Ukraine's immediate neighbors are thinking about what a European future would look like. And the most important interaction here was between Poland and Ukraine. Now, why is this so important? It's so important for the reason I tried to stress before. The Ukrainian national movement, or the idea of Ukrainian national state, has never been weaker than others. It's had more enemies, which is a different thing. In the 1970s, this situation begins to change for the first time. As a result, in a distant, indirect way, because of this thing called Europe. What do I mean? Well, Ukraine loses its Polish enemy in two ways. The first is a very brutal one. Over the course of the Second World War, and especially in 1943, the force of Ukrainian nationalism, which was a very real force at the time, was turned chiefly against the Polish population. In 1943 and 1944, Ukrainian nationalists carried out the largest non-state ethnic cleansing in history, right? Thereby removing a good deal of the Polish minority from what's now Western Ukraine. But then the second part of this is much more interesting. In the 1970s, a group of Polish political thinkers, rather than focusing on that episode of ethnic cleansing, and rather than focusing on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, instead made the intellectual move of recognizing Ukraine in its existing boundaries. Now that is a shocking, shocking move. Any of you who are concerned with the politics of history or the politics of memory, and I know that many of you here are aware that there are few things that are harder to forget than bloody massacres of your own people and losing territory, right? And that's the history of Poland in the Second World War. Poland lost half of its territory, right, including what's now Western Ukraine. It lost half of its territory, and while it was losing this territory, episodes of ethnic cleansing were going on against Poles. Normally, the politics of memory would be to say, once we have a chance, we're going to restore our losses. Instead, something interesting happened in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s with intellectuals around Solidarność, the Solidarity movement. They made a different move. Their move was to say, we are going to imagine, remember, Poland is not a sovereign state, right? We are going to imagine a European future in which both Poland and Ukraine are going to be in Europe. Now that is admittedly a utopian thought, right, in the 1970s. We're going to imagine a European future, and in that European future, national borders are going to matter less. Therefore, what we do now is we recognize the Polish-Ukrainian border. So this was an intellectual conversation that happened in the 1970s and 1980s, which then, in the early 1990s, actually became Polish foreign policy. So in a very interesting move, in 1990, before Ukraine was a state, right, the Soviet Union still existed. Before Ukraine was a state, Warsaw recognized its boundary with Soviet Ukraine. Now, this was very clever because it was, in effect, the end of the Polish enemy. It meant that when the Ukrainian national movement got going in 1990 and 1991, it was focused almost entirely on Moscow, right? Which is something new in history, right? Today, when we see Russian mercenaries in eastern Ukraine, we might think that Russian-Ukrainian conflict is normal and natural, but it's not. It's something very new in history. The idea that the Ukrainian national movement is chiefly about Russia is something which is very new. It's only really been true for the last 25 or 30 years. And so this is an important moment, as I see it, in the creation of Ukraine as a subject in history, as an actor in history, as a national actor. Because from that point forward, from 1990, Ukrainian statehood becomes thinkable and possible, right? And indeed it's achieved in 1991. Now, the first years of independent Ukraine, beginning in 1991, are a moment where Ukrainian policy, both domestically and internationally, is characterized by oscillations, by shifts. So from 1991, the year of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the year of Ukrainian independence, until 2013, Ukrainian policy in foreign affairs was a matter of shifting between West and East. It was a kind of baby geopolitics, right? First you go west, and then when you don't like what happens there, you go back east, and you tell the people in Russia that if they're not nice, you'll go back west, and you repeat this for about 20 years. That is essentially what Ukrainian foreign policy all the way through, I mean, under everyone, until 2013. And in Ukrainian domestic policy, again, I mean, I'm simplifying a lot, but I wish I were simplifying more, if you see what I mean. Ukrainian domestic policy was largely a matter of oscillating between one oligarchical clan and another. All of this changed in 2013. And the question that I want to ask in closing is, what exactly changed in 2013? Why was it that in late 2013, suddenly we had a Ukrainian, what I see as a Ukrainian left-wing national revolution? Why all of a sudden are there tens and hundreds of thousands, even millions of people on the street at the end of 2013 and early 2014? And I think here, the answer to the question has to do less with Ukraine and more with history and more with Russia. And this is where I want to return to my major theme. In this lecture, I've tried to present history in three very conservative ways. I mean, as a historian, I am very conservative. I mean, as a human being, I hope that I'm not, but as a historian, I'm very conservative. I've tried to present history as a story that goes from past to future. I've tried to show how history is a project, that is, how people try to gather other people into a project which has a past, a present, and a future. And then I've tried to show how history can be a source of lessons, right? How people can learn from history, and how if we want to understand what's happening, we have to know what lessons other people are drawing from history, right? That's the very conventional way that I've tried to present history. But what's happened since 2013 is something which is intellectually very interesting, but politically astonishingly dangerous. And that is to say, the reimagination of history in a fourth way. The reimagination of history itself in a, what I would call, see, this is me being conservative, a postmodern way. That is, where history is not a matter of continuity, not a matter of projects, not a matter of lessons, but where history is a kind of shopping mall. Where history is something that you walk into, and there are glittering things here, glittering things there, interesting things there, and you pull things off the shelf. You take whatever you want. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the way that history is now being presented in Moscow. I'm talking about the Eurasian movement associated with certain far-right thinkers in Russia, and the way in which it's become Russian foreign policy. What Russia has done in 2013, especially since fall 2013, is to reconceive history itself as a series of consumer images, right? Look, there's Stalin. Look, there's Hitler. Look, there's Mussolini. Maybe Stalin wasn't so bad. Hitler probably wasn't so bad either. Mussolini certainly not so bad. We're going to exploit what we want from everywhere in order to give you a new version of what happened in the past in order to justify what's happening in the present. Now, this has taken on a form of an attack on the European Union. An attack on the European Union in which Ukraine is interesting just because it was first, just because it was in the way. When we think about what happened on the Maidan, it's very easy to say what happened was protesters in Ukraine were opposed by Russia. And that is true. That is true. There's a very conventional way you can describe the story, which is that Ukraine was going to join in an association agreement with the European Union. This was stopped. This led to protests. The protests were fought with violence. This led to revolution. Moscow backed more violence. This led to the overthrow of the Ukrainian regime and a new pro-Western Ukrainian government. That is all true. It's perfectly true to look at this as foreign policy and to say that Russia pushed too far, they got the exact opposite of what they wanted, they got angry, they invaded Crimea. That is all true, but it's only, I think, the surface of what happened. I think the depth of what happened is something more important and more threatening, which is that as Russia was resisting the Maidan, it revealed the ways that it was thinking about Europe. I don't know how many of you were watching Russian television in November, December, and January, but the way the Maidan was presented was as not as the Euromaidan, but as the gay Euromaidan, right? Everything there was the sincere and uncomplicated desire of Ukrainians to live in a state which did not steal from them was presented as a conspiracy of Nazis and gays, or gay Nazis, or Nazi gays, or however you prefer it, centered in Brussels, but of course Brussels is actually the puppet of Washington, right? So the gay fascist masters are in Washington, then we have the gay fascist subordinates in Brussels, and then the gay fascist puppets are in Ukraine, right? So this, again, I wish I were simplifying more than I am in this presentation. Now what's interesting about this is the way that, we have moved from a politics of East and West, where Ukraine is in the middle, to a politics of two competing projects, where it was Ukraine's desire to be in the European Union which triggers this particular and very revealing reaction. A reaction in which this counter logic, this new logic of history reveals itself in ways more and less profound. The more profound way is the flat-on, direct attack on conventional modes of history. So for example, the European Union has a standard way of processing the 20th century, which is that the Second World War was a bad thing, Nazi Germany certainly also bad, Stalinism probably bad, although let's have some debates about it. And we're going to learn lessons from this, right? And the main lesson is that democracy and liberalism with some bit of the welfare state is good, right? The main lesson is that integration is better than disintegration. The Eurasian project is a direct, flat-on attack against all of that. Democracy bad, liberalism bad, social welfare state bad, integration bad. There are no lessons from the 20th century. Remember, we're in a different historical mode. All you have in the 20th century are images, are possibilities. So therefore, there's no problem in saying, as was recently argued in Izvestia, there's no problem in saying that Hitler was a reasonable statesman who was put under too much pressure by the West. Problem in saying, as was recently said on Russian national television, that the Jews brought the Holocaust on themselves. There's no problem in saying anything which seems momentarily useful, because history is not the past. History is just a source of political technology in the present. And when you have this in mind, the way that the Russian propaganda, and for that matter the Russian political leadership, presents Ukraine becomes not so much a matter of political propaganda as part of a much bigger intellectual recreation of Europe itself. So if the Russian leadership presents the Ukrainian government as a Nazi junta or a fascist junta, you can say, well, that seems to be a mistake, right? You could say, well, the far right in Ukraine has less support than in any European Union member country. You could say the far right is in power in Russia, it's not in power in Ukraine. You could say the first people who were killed in the Ukrainian Revolution were Belarusian and an Armenian. You could say the Ukrainian Revolution seemed to be mainly about left-wing goals rather than right-wing goals. You could point all of these things out, and of course you would be correct. The government in Ukraine is a matter of, a moderate chocolatier. It's not a matter of a fascist junta. These are fairly straightforward factual questions. And I and a lot of other people have spent a lot of time pointing out these very simple factual things. But in a way that's beside the point. Because what we are all being invited to do, and what you in particular in Europe are being invited to do, is to enter a world in which it's not the facts that matter. It's not the history that matters. It's not history as a story that matters. It's not history as a project that matters. It's not history as lessons that matters. What matters is history as a source of momentary inspiration. right? So if we're inspired to say something nice about Hitler and that inspires us, great. If we're inspired to say something about the Holocaust and that inspires us, fine. History is not serious. History is one source of political technology among others. And the worrying thing, of course, is how well this works, right? The worrying thing is how unable history is to defend itself. The worrying thing is the way that this is all a very successful temptation. So we do have, as a matter of fact, see, I'm conservative, as a matter of fact, we have very many people who think that the government in Ukraine is a fascist junta, right? In Germany, no doubt even here. There are a lot of people who think that sort of thing, and that's a problem. But what's more concerning is that we have a large number of people, in Germany especially, who are tempted by this style of history, right? This grasping after a glorious moment, the specification of history as an image rather than as a source of truth or lessons or logic. And this is the part, by the way, I'm now drawing to my conclusion, but this is the part of what's happening in the world today which I see as most clearly fascist. This style of seeing history is unambiguously fascist. It was invented by Sorel, who was very explicit that history is not about these things I'm talking about, story, projects, lessons. History is a grab bag of myths. There is no such thing as truth. Words are only there to describe the past in such a way as to motivate action in the present. Once the action has happened, words are there again to make a myth of what has just happened, right? This presentation of history, everything else aside, is, I think, the single most fascist thing which is happening. And if one is looking for fascism, as many people seem to like to do, here's a place where you can find it. The rejection of history in the modes that I've described it, and the embrace of history as the source precisely of nothing more than motivational myth. Now, where does that leave us? I keep picking this up as though I have notes on it, right? Where does that leave us today? It seems to me that you are at a historical turning point in two different ways. We're at a historical turning point in the political way that the European Union now has an alternative, right? For better or for worse, the politics of the European Union have been the politics of no alternatives, right? The Germans have a nice word for this, Alternativlosigkeit. The politics, so in my country, right, in America, the politics of no alternatives is the politics of the free market. We say, there's no alternative to the free market, and everyone has to say, yes, that's right, there's no. In the European Union, the politics of no alternative is, there's no alternative to integration. We've all learned our lesson. It makes sense economically, it makes sense politically. We've all learned our lesson, there's no alternative. And now suddenly there is. And when you're used to there not being an alternative, it's sometimes very hard to confront an alternative. It's hard to even admit that it exists. Because part of thinking that there's no alternative, it's like being a teenager and having parents, right? You don't know that there's a world out there. You only know that there's your parents. And you think rebellion is rebelling against your parents, right? You're not aware that there are actual hostile forces in the world. There's just your parents. The politics of no alternative is like that. You think the only thing you can do is resist the EU, right? That's the only kind of rebellion that there would be. In fact, the EU is just one thing in the world. And the EU at this point has an adversary. In fact, it has an enemy. And this enemy is already working very hard inside the European Union itself. The Eurasian project is not about Russia, it's not about Ukraine. It's about Europe. In fact, it's about something bigger than Europe. It's about undoing the whole historical mode which has created the kinds of lives which has made Europe as an entity possible. And the way that the Eurasian project reaches into Europe, and many of you will now know the details of this better than me, is that the Eurasian project is an alliance of the Russian far right, which happens to be in power, and the European far right, which is more or less important, the Front National more important, right? Other parties less important. And you'll notice that the European far right, although it has many disagreements among itself, there are two things about which it is agreed. No one on the European far right supports Ukraine, even though Ukraine is supposed to be, on the far right. No one on the European far right supports Ukraine, and everyone on the European far right supports the Putin regime. Now, why is that? It's because the European far right is part of a larger project to destroy the European Union. This has moral implications, right? I mean, basically the people who claim to be patriots are not. The people who claim that they oppose European integration actually are supporters of a different European integration, but they don't admit it, right? Because the European Union has an alternative. The false alternative, the alternative that does not really exist, is the return to the nation state. That's not going to happen. That's impossible. And if it did happen, it would be a nightmare. But that's not there. That's the false alternative. That's the dream that people of the far right, from Austria to Scotland, are putting up, that we could return to the nation state. That isn't going to happen. What can happen is that the European Union can become weaker and the Eurasian project can become stronger. That is the alternative. It's really there now. It's really there for you. It presents itself to you in all kinds of nice guises. It presents itself to you as freedom. It presents itself to you as patriotism. And to certain of your elites, it presents itself to you as profit, which is the material side of all this. Now, the material side of all this is very simple. And again, there are people here who have written about this. The material side of it has everything to do with something very simple. Again, I'll return to my country. In my country, the source of conservative politics is hydrocarbons, right? It leads us to do some natural gas, oil. It leads us to do very simple, very stupid things, like elect Republicans, invade countries. I admit it. It's a more or less universal truth that hydrocarbons lead people to the right, because hydrocarbons create vested interests in which lazy people sit on sources of profit and they don't want to lose it. In all of the beautiful propaganda, all the pyrotechnics of the Russian Eurasian project, which we spend so much time, and I've spent a lot of time now myself talking about, there is one underlying and very simple goal, and that is the Russian regime depends upon the sale of hydrocarbons to Europe, also to China, but above all to Europe. It will be much simpler for the Russian regime in the future if it can continue to sell hydrocarbons to Europe. The European Union, if it continues to exist, will come up with a common energy policy, most likely. If the European Union falls apart and the Russians can deal with Italy and Greece and Austria and Bulgaria as nation states, right, then there will be no common energy policy, and the people who make lots of money in Russia by controlling hydrocarbons will continue to do so. In other words, there is an alternative. In ideological terms, I've tried to show you how interesting the alternatives are. The Eurasian project intellectually is extremely interesting, just like fascism is extremely interesting, by no coincidence. In political terms, it's not interesting. In political terms, you're at a turning point. You have alternatives. One of your alternatives, here in Bulgaria, as in Southeastern Europe, as in Europe as a whole, is that you act in such a way as to make it very easy for a small number of people to make lots of money from gas and oil. And you lose the greatest zone of peace and prosperity in the history of the world. The other alternative is you continue to be boring. You make it a little bit harder for a small group of people to make a huge amount of money from selling hydrocarbons, and you preserve the largest zone of peace and prosperity in the history of the world. Those seem to be the alternatives. Today, in Sofia, as elsewhere, those seem to be the alternatives. And when I say this is a historical turning point, and this is my last remark, I don't mean just that we really are at a moment where choices matter a lot. We are, all of us. But I also mean something more fundamental. What I see happening is a kind of change in how history itself is felt and experienced. This alternative, the one where a small number of people who control hydrocarbons make lots of money, is associated with a postmodern history of gesture and symbol and glory. A consumer history where you do something in the short term which feels very nice, and then you suffer in the long term. Whereas this kind of history, the preservation of the European Union, is associated with boring, conservative, lesson learning, precedent drawing, research doing history. I am not sure which of these modes of history is going to win. This kind of history, I'm sorry that I'm blaming you, I mean, and you in particular, I keep looking at you for the time, but this kind of history has a force, it has an attraction, right, and very talented people are carrying it out. This kind of history has a hard time defending itself. What I have tried to do in this lecture is to make those two kinds of history explicit. To make it clear that Ukraine does have a history, that was my boring point, and to make it clear that the way that we think about history, not just Ukrainian history, but European history, the history of the world, the way that we think about history has tremendous political implications. Tremendous political implications for the future. And the things which may seem like a lot of fun now, casting away lessons, forgetting about projects, seizing on moments of enthusiasm, these things can be very, very dangerous. In fact, although we've forgotten it, these things are a danger that we know. These things are the way that history has been used by fascism in the past. And these things require an awful lot of work. Again, I don't know why you're the good guys over here. I mean, it's not like you're smiling or anything. But these things over here require a huge amount of labor. They can be very demanding and boring. They're not exciting very often, but they are part of a certain political project. So the choice is not just between Europe and Eurasia. You've got that choice, you know, and I honestly have no idea which way you're going to go. You have that choice. But underlying that choice is a choice about how we think about history or what history really is. So I've come before you, as you can see, to defend what I take to be history of the boring kind, but I hope in its expression it hasn't been boring for you. Thank you very much.
Преди 25 години друг американец разказа за края на историята. Сега видяхме друг вариант на края на историята. Историята, която спира да бъде разказ и която спира да има поуки. И трето, разбира се, всяка историческа лекция има две заплахи. Едната, че това, което историците говорят, няма никаква връзка с това, което ни се случва сега. Другата, че това, което говорят, има прекалено много връзка с което ни се случва сега. Истината е, че когато поканихме Тимоти Снайдер след тази лекция, нямаше още дебати по Южен поток, но в някакъв смисъл се оказва, че тази лекция е била планирана да бъде произнесена днес. Ние имаме 30 минути за дискусия, затова молбата ми е въпроси и изказвания, ако може по-бързо, за да може повече хора да могат да зададат въпроси. Тимоти Снайдер.
Ще задам въпроса на английски. It was a fascinating lecture. We covered lots of ground. I was wondering, when you discussed the political technology of picking and choosing this postmodern style of history making, I mean, it's also the fact that it resonates with historical trauma in Russian society. So it feeds into a narrative that has been there for a long time of victimhood, of insecurity. So I guess it's a bit more complicated, and there's a lot of conservative history, imagination even on the Russian side. But my question is really about Ukraine. I was fascinated by your discussion about this turn in Polish thinking about the past. And certainly it becomes interesting, can an anti-colonial national movement in Ukraine, as you described it, can it think critically about its past to deal with the past? And obviously there is a lot of violence and trauma on the Ukrainian side as well. And certainly the elephant in the room is the Holocaust. Yeah, this is the binding element, which incidentally happens to be also part of the historical supermarket, in that all parties use and abuse the memory of the Holocaust. If you care to comment on how Ukrainians address or don't address the past and the injustices done by Ukrainians themselves in the Ukrainian national movement. And finally, a footnote. What's fascinating is also that you mentioned Scotland. Scotland, the Scottish National Party, is a left-wing movement. It's a sovereignty movement, but it's in the final analysis, its battle cry is restoring the welfare state. So much of what you describe as this nostalgia for national sovereignty happens also on the left, and Scotland is a good example. And by the way, Scotland, the cause is viable because it's imagined in a big European context. In a way, the bargain they propose for the referendum is we split, but then we become viable because we keep the pound and also we are embedded in a larger. So there's something going on not only on the far right but also on the left.
Okay. So I quite agree with you that what's happening now confounds left and right in many ways, but there are some moments where we can be clear. And with the Russians, I think you put your finger on something very important. The content is often very conservative, or I would prefer reactionary. The content is hyper-traditional. So the content depends upon all of the kinds of things which I've tried to show are not really true in history. The content depends upon the idea that there is a continuous Russian history. It starts in Kiev. You know, there's never really been a Ukraine. There's never been a Ukrainian state. Russia's always been there the whole time. It's been ruled by Russians the whole time. None of these propositions are true, right? None of them is even remotely true. It depends, as you say, upon the notion of Russian martyrdom, especially in the Second World War, where, and of course, compared to France or the United States or Bulgaria, Russians suffered tremendously in the Second World War, but compared to Belarusians or Ukrainians or Jews, they did not. It's a completely different scale in Ukraine. Both the military and the civilian fighting and dying was much more intense in Ukraine than it was in Russia. And this is systematically forgotten, and indeed it's reversed with this idea that the Ukrainians are fascists and so on. Which brings me to the question of Ukrainian nationalism, or the harms that Ukrainians have done to others. This is actually one area where you see, I think, a difference between Ukraine and Russia. There isn't a national discussion about the Holocaust in Russia. There is one in Ukraine. It has problems, but it exists. There's a serious museum of the Holocaust in Dnipropetrovsk. There's a serious Center for Holocaust Studies in the same place. Some of the best recent factographical histories of the Holocaust have been done by Ukrainian historians. It should be much better than it is, but it's there. It's there as a topic, not only in academics, but then here's where it gets interesting, in politics. One of the big contradictions, I'll say this the other way. One of the interesting things that we've seen from the Maidan has been the emergence of Ukrainian Jews. So Ukrainian Jews in the same sense that you have French Jews and American Jews. One of my definitions of nationhood is that you have your own Jews, right? That the Jews who live in your country think of themselves as being American Jews, French Jews, Ukrainian Jews. One of the things which happened in the Maidan was that the Kiev and the Dnipropetrovsk Jewish community, which are the two biggest ones, were very actively present, right? I mean, as everyone probably doesn't know, or maybe but should, Jews were very prominent on the Maidan. There were a number, in fact, of Ukrainian Israelis who returned to the Maidan to fight. In fact, some of the most effective of the Ukrainian nationalist commanders were trained in the Israeli Defense Forces, which is why they knew how to storm buildings. For some reason, this story doesn't overwhelm the mass media, but it's true. One of the people who was shot in the sniper massacre in February was a Jewish veteran of the Red Army. But more important than the combat stuff is the simple civil presence of Jews on the Maidan. and the identification of the Jewish elite with the Ukrainian state. Now this is something which we haven't noticed, but it's very important and very interesting because, of course, these people, these men and women, are aware of what you're talking about, right? I mean, they're much more aware than we are of the history of the Holocaust and how important it is. And their commitment is that this can be done in Ukraine. It doesn't have to be done in America or Israel. It can be done in Ukraine itself. And that's something which I find very interesting. And it's one of these simple facts, you know, the existence of Ukrainian Jews, which you have to be kind of patient to appreciate the interest of. It's not as much fun as the Russian propaganda. I mean, the Russian propaganda, here's a place where you know, they demonstrate their immunity to contradiction. On the one hand, they claim that Ukraine is a Nazi junta. On the other hand, they also claim that the existence of Ukraine is part of the international Jewish conspiracy. Right? You can't really have both of those views at the same time, but nevertheless, both of those views are present in Russian propaganda. The truth is much more, the truth requires more patience. It's not as exciting as either of those versions, but you know, it's the truth which I think really helps us out here. So that's as far as I'm going to go with that. Thanks.
My name is Tom Pavlov. I'm a first-year student in the New York University in Abu Dhabi. Thank you, Professor, for this great lecture. So you mentioned that since the collapse of the Soviet Union until 2013, we see different oligarch clans. But now we have something different. However, don't you think that even now, on the presidential elections, we saw another oligarch that has been there for several generations in different governments? He has been both with Yanukovych and then during the Orange Revolutions, again, I'm talking about Pyotr Poroshenko. So don't you think that we still have the oligarchs ruling, just a different clan? Same for the, in the parliament, the current government with Yatsenyuk, with the head of the government, that we still have some old faces, not the new generation, not the young people that were on the Maidan, the Euromaidan. And also, don't you think in terms of the media and how the media covered the event, in Russia there was much more emphasis on there is an emphasis on how many innocent people are suffering from this, while in the Western media it's more only about the separatists. While in the Russian media they touch a little bit more, I think, on the fact that many innocent people are also affected by the fights and all of this. And what's the point? So do you think that there is such a difference in, do you see it? Because you see both, I'm sure that you're looking at both the Western and the Russian media.
My point in all of this is not that the current Ukrainian government is wonderful, or that, you know, Poroshenko is my best friend, or, you know, that Yatsenyuk was the best man at my marriage. You know, that's not the point. I mean, Ukraine has very serious internal political problems, which I think in a better world with less outside interference, it would probably be able to solve. With oligarchy, this was a theme that I meant to actually develop in my lecture more than I did, because I think that oligarchical pluralism is a long-term theme in Ukrainian history, going back all the way to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when the local warlords were allowed to become nobles, right? And as nobles, they became magnates, and as magnates, they oppressed the local population and fought the Cossacks, right? So, but that was a kind of pluralism, because each magnate, each oligarch, had his own court, his own scribes, his own poets, you know, supported Baroque culture in a different way, right? So this is a kind of a long-term theme. Soviet history involves getting rid of the old oligarchs, right? And at the end of Soviet history involves the creation of new native oligarchs, right? I mean, that's true in Russia and Ukraine both. But then you have a different story, and in Russia, the new oligarchs are more or less subordinated. And then Ukraine, they more or less get to control the state. Now, I would insert something important into your narrative, though, which is that when you get to 2013, two things are different. I emphasized the transformation of Russia into Eurasia. But something else happens, which is that Yanukovych changes the rules of the game inside Ukraine. Yanukovych, in particular, I think his son, are no longer willing to play the game of the president is a minor oligarch and there are bigger oligarchs. Instead, he was aiming for something like, oligarchical monopoly. And he was actually working again, and with some success, actually. I mean, Akhmetov was much less important by the end of 2013 than people thought. Trying to control the wealth himself, right? And so he was moving towards something new. And therefore, the Maidan and the revolution was against oligarchy in general, but it was also against that oligarch in particular. I mean, Yanukovych was seen as particularly obnoxious, not just as the commander, not just as the executive, but also as a kind of oligarch in chief. And so if we make a scheme out of this, the way I see it is that the revolution on the Maidan was, in some sense, objectively from the left, because it was largely against oligarchy, although people didn't normally use the word, and for the rule of law. There are many reasons why I think there should be Ukrainian parliamentary elections this fall. Then let's see how well the young people from the Maidan do. As you know, in Kiev, we just had municipal elections for the first time in 2008, which did lead to many people from the new political class actually having a position of responsibility. So I expect that would happen as well with national parliamentary elections. But presidential elections for this are not enough, right? I mean, Poroshenko is a special figure. I mean, one of the many reasons why he's not a member of, why he's not really a member of a Nazi junta is precisely what you've said. How can he be a member of a Nazi junta if he used to work for Yanukovych, right? He's an old-style politician who then was on the Maidan and gained a lot of sympathy, right? He's not quite an oligarch in the same way that some of the oligarchs are, in that, I mean, of course, what I'm going to say you have to put a kind of Ukrainian asterisk on, but he actually started a business and sells something as opposed to controlling a pipeline, right? So he did actually create a business, there's something to be said for that. And then on your question about the media, with the innocent people, I don't think that's the main division between Russia and the West. I mean, I think it's much more radical than that. In Russia, you don't know that Russian citizens were killed, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time I checked, lots of Russian citizens were killed. They weren't innocent. I mean, they were carrying automatic weapons at the time, but they were killed. That's not even covered, right, as far as I know in Russian media. That is covered in Ukrainian and Western media. The Russian media's main angle is that this is a kind of internal conflict with lots of suffering. The Ukrainian media's main angle is that this is a foreign intervention. Both things are true. If you put them together, then there's a lot of foreign intervention. There are a lot of mercenaries, including Chechens, in eastern Ukraine right now. There are a number of ex-GRU officers who are there, right? A suspiciously large number in eastern Ukraine. So there is a Russian intervention, and that Russian intervention is causing a lot of suffering, which, in my view, wouldn't be happening otherwise. There is no tradition in Ukraine in the past 25 years of ethnic conflict of this sort or of armed strife of this sort. There's nothing like this. It has never happened before. And I think the external intervention, I mean, again, to summarize, is designed to create an image, a reality, and therefore an image of strife and suffering among innocents. I mean, Putin's announced doctrine of how he was going to fight this war on April 4th was, we are going to stand behind the women and children and try to make them shoot at us. I mean, that's what he said, right? And that's how they're fighting the war, and it has the consequences that it has.
Решите само една история, свързана с олигархическия плурализъм в Украйна. Андреас Асланд, икономист, разказва история, която дори не е вярна и красива, че през 2010 година, след избирането на Янукович, той кани ключовите олигарси в страната и се опитва да реализира тази централизация, за която говорим, казвайки им, вижте, ситуацията се промени, Украйна има нужда от повече централизация, вие трябва да поделите властта, която имате, и ако някой от вас има каквито и да било съмнение, че това ще се случи, искам да ви припомня едно име. Името е Юлия Гурковска, на което един от олигарсите казва, разрешете и аз да ви припомня едно име. Джон Ф. Кенеди. Този разговор, навярно, може да се случи в Украина и едва ли може да се случи в Москва. Така че, последен въпрос, ако има. Заповядайте.
I'll try to speak up. Can you hear me?
За превода ще е трудно.
Thank you again for the great and much needed, I think, presentation. My name is Boris Ukam, and I have two questions. The first one is, you talked at length about the development and the evolution of the Ukrainian nationalism, but you never confined it to certain geographical boundaries. And I wonder how these boundaries would match with the current geographical boundaries of the country, and whether that's at least at part, at the heart of the conflict. And the second question is, you seem to be very surprised by the success of Russian propaganda. And I wonder why that is, given the many historical instances of successful propaganda acts, and people generally respond to emotional stimuli very strongly. And at war, as the saying goes, at war it is the truth that dies first. So, thanks.
Thanks. So thanks for these great questions. Thanks for all the questions. The borders in Ukrainian story are very interesting because, for the most part, the border questions were resolved from the outside. So something that I forgot to say, which is very important, is that the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, right, when the Soviet Union was established in 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was itself a compromise. Right? I mean, in a way, the whole Soviet Union was a compromise because the people who made the Soviet Union, they didn't want to make a state. They wanted to make a revolution. They didn't want a Russian revolution. They wanted a world revolution. They thought they were taking part in the world revolution. They thought that Russia would be the spark that set off the powder keg of the world revolution. And when that turned out not to be true, they had to make a compromise. And that compromise was a state called the Soviet Union, which is already a paradox, as I tried to describe from the beginning, because it's trying to imitate capitalism in order to surpass it. But within that compromise, there was the compromise of the so-called Second Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was there precisely because Lenin, right, unlike Putin, Lenin actually believed that there was a serious Ukrainian question. Right? I mean, they've just fought long wars in Ukraine, right? They've taken lots of casualties from Ukrainian patriots. A Ukrainian army had come with the Polish army and taken Kiev in May of 1919, right? They were aware that there was a Ukrainian nationality. They were perfectly aware of that. Lenin was aware of that. Stalin was aware of that. How they thought about it is a different question, but they knew it was there. And they meant to contain it and channel it by creating the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The idea is that we have a policy of affirmative action for Ukrainians against Russians and against Jews. We promote them, we create a new Ukrainian elite. That Ukrainian elite will be grateful to us, it will be Soviet, it will be communist, it will become part of the vanguard, which will bring us all towards revolution. That was the idea. It's a very interesting idea. But that meant that, in fact, the Soviet Union was creating borders. And those borders, by the way, went back and forth. As everyone forgets, those borders used to go well into the east of what's now Russia, right? Ukrainian borders were actually changed within the Soviet Union. Everyone is obsessed with how Ukraine got Crimea from the Russian Federation. As far as I know, no one ever mentions that Ukraine actually gave up territories in the Don to Russia in the 1920s. But anyway, the point is that the Ukrainian border question was mostly answered by the Soviet Union. And the second part of this was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Ribbentrop Pact takes half of Poland and it gives roughly a quarter of Poland to Ukraine. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact borders are restored after the Second World War. And then, not only are those borders restored, but the NKVD continues the ethnic cleansing project of Ukrainian nationalists. Whereas the Ukrainian nationalists have been killing Poles to try to get them to leave. The NKVD kills some, but mostly it puts them on trains. But they did that precisely because they thought they were solving the Ukrainian question. Stalin's calculation, and again it's quite intelligent, is that if we give them the borders they want, And if we give the nationalists the ethnic homogeneity they seem to want, then the Ukrainian question is over. So in the 1920s, you have this kind of optimistic Soviet Ukrainian policy. We give them the future. In the 1940s, you have a more pessimistic policy. We give them the past. We give them the things that nationalists want. We give them borders, we give them ethnic purity, and then they'll be loyal, right? But this is just a long way of answering your question. For the most part, Ukrainians, even on the far right, don't have territorial claims on their neighbors. How, if your question means, in what parts of Ukraine is the Ukrainian national idea more resonant? That's a very interesting question. Because right now, the absolute capital of Ukrainian patriotism is Kiev, the city of Kiev, the mother of all Russian cities. It is the absolute world center of Ukrainian patriotism, or nationalism, as you prefer. There are more Ukrainian patriots, more people who sacrifice for Ukraine, have sacrificed for Ukraine in Kiev than anywhere else, which is very interesting because apart from anything else, it's a Russian-speaking city, which is the hidden reason why the international politics of this are so hard for Moscow. Because in the Maidan, right, if you were in the Maidan, in general, not everybody, but in general, if you stood up and made a speech, you made it in Ukrainian, because Ukrainian is the language of politics. Right? It's a language of political solidarity, it's a language of culture. And then when you got down from your speech, your best buddy said in Russian, molodets, right? They said, great speech, good job, in Russian, right? It was the Russian-speaking middle classes that were the motor of the Ukrainian revolution in Kiev. And that's why all this is so hard in Russia, by the way, I think, because it shows that if you look at the Maidan seriously, it shows not only that there are Ukrainians, which is hard enough. It also shows that there are Russian speakers who can make a revolution. Now that's a problem, right? That's a problem from a certain point of view. So anyway, so the center of Ukrainian patriotism is now Kiev. And this is interesting because 20 years ago when I started working on this place, Lviv, Western Ukraine, looked at Kiev and said, that's alien, it's expensive, it's post-Soviet, they all speak Russian. Whereas now Lviv looks at Kiev and it says, that's like us. They're like us, maybe even more so. And the language question, at least in that part of the country, has totally lost its resonance. It doesn't really mean anything. Ukrainian patriotism is obviously less pronounced in the southeast of the country, which is where the famine was worse in the 1930s. By no coincidence. Where the places where the famine was worse, where the local Ukrainian population was wiped out and then replaced by people who came from elsewhere, naturally, you get families like the Yanukovych family, which come from elsewhere, where Ukrainian patriotism is less rooted. It's also the case that these were just the more industrialized parts of the country, which had workers and managers coming in from all over the place. So Ukrainian patriotism is less resonant in the southeast. There's no question about that. Even there, though, if people are asked, are you Ukrainian or not? Everybody, basically everybody says they're Ukrainian. Do you want to stay in Ukraine or not? Even among ethnic Russians, the majority is we want to stay in the country, and the overall population is overwhelming. I think the difference is, and this is where things become interesting, the difference is that no one in Luhansk or Donetsk, or very few people, relatively few people, some people have, I shouldn't say a few people, some people have, but very few people have taken political action, have taken risks on behalf of Ukraine. And this is where the Russian military intervention becomes so important, because what's happening with the Russian military intervention is that people are forced to take sides. And you now have a lot, as of May 2014, you have a lot more Ukrainian nationalists in Donetsk and Luhansk than you had in January 2014. Because the Russian presence forces people to take sides. It forces them to think about it forces them to think about who they're going to be, right? And sometimes, who they're going to be before they run away. There are now massive, there are now tens of thousands of East Ukrainian refugees in Western Ukraine. But also, and what it means that you had to run away from Russia. But also, if you're going to fight, what are you fighting for, right? Or if someone suffered or someone you died, why exactly? And in those situations, you get a lot more nationalism. So, it's very interesting about this. The Russian intervention is very interesting because at every step, literally every step, everything that Putin has done, from getting Yanukovych not to sign the association agreement, to providing Russian money on the condition that Yanukovych clear the Maidan, to intervening in Crimea, and to sending mercenaries, every single thing Putin has done has consolidated Ukrainian national identity. Every single thing. And so his choices keep getting more and more radical. Because if he wants to stop the Ukrainian national identity that he himself has created, he's going to have to intervene more and more massively. And then the costs for him become greater and greater. Now, that's a kind of abstract way of looking at, of course, what is a terrible humanitarian crisis in eastern Ukraine. The fundamental truth about what's happening in eastern Ukraine is that it's a terrible humanitarian crisis. People are suffering, and it's not clear in the name of what they're suffering. Almost nobody there wants to join Russia, and the numbers are lower now than they were 2 months ago. The issues of decentralization can be handled by elections, by early elections. They can be handled by constitutional decentralization. It's really not clear why so many people have to die and so many people have to flee. And that, that's the sadness of what's happening in eastern Ukraine right now.
Thank you. Благодаря. Ако има някой, който мисли, че няма да спи тая вечер, ако не зададе въпроса си. Ако няма такъв, Иван.
Hi, my name is David Jimbos, I'm a journalist. I just want to very quickly get your opinion and touch on corruption and what is corruption's role in this whole thing, because on one hand we can talk about this. It's a tool, it's an instrument of foreign policy, just like the connections with the far right. On the other hand, it's something that sort of in our country seems to self-propagate, seems to like almost the state exists in order to create corruption, and that's also connected with these oligarchs. And the Maidan movement is actually in a way not just anti-oligarch, but anti-corruption, because corruption creates oligarchs who destroy economies as opposed to build businesses, like you said. So it's interesting to see, what's the point of history on corruption and how that works.
No. If I were a serious historian of law and institutions, this would be my subject for this lecture. Because that is absolutely the most important thing which is going on. I'm not going to talk about Bulgaria because I don't know it, but in Ukraine, the thing that the people in the Maidan have in common with the people in the anti-Maidan is this. They both think that the government in Kiev is corrupt, and they're both right. Like that is the thing which on the surface, they're in opposition to each other. And in many cases they hate each other and have fought. But that question of the rule of law is the fundamental question in Ukrainian politics, from Chernivtsi to Donetsk. That is the question. And I think a successful Ukrainian government, is going to be one, going back a bit to your question, is going to be one which makes persuasively the case that we're going to make government be less corrupt, in Luhansk and in Lviv. That's going to be the government that succeeds, because this is the question. Now, it connects to the Russian military intervention as well, because the Russian military intervention is a test of the corruptibility of the Ukrainian state. Certain institutions of the Ukrainian state turn out to be less corrupt than maybe one would have thought, like the border control. Certain are kind of in the middle, like the SKU. The army seems to have been rather a big problem, and the navy as well. And now the state is working all these things out. And interestingly, I think this is going to be a process of state building for Ukraine. But there's a way in which this is even more fundamental. And again, if I were a historian of different things, I would have made the whole lecture about this. What's really at stake in legal terms or political terms is not Russia, Ukraine, Europe. What's really at stake is the rule of law. Because this whole problem of oligarchy, Ukrainian oligarchy, is not a Ukrainian problem. It's a Ukrainian-European problem. To be an oligarch, you have to have three things. You have to have a ton of money, you have to have a secure position in Ukrainian politics, and you have to have the European rule of law. Because you need a predictable place to park your money, to found your front companies, to send your children, to go on vacation, etc., etc. In other words, it all depends on the rule of law, but it also corrupts the rule of law. Because in general, when you park your money or you launder it, you're breaking some rules along the way. You're corrupting some bankers, you're corrupting some politicians. So you need the rule of law to be you, but you're also corrupting the rule of law, right? And with Russia, the whole thing takes place on a massive scale, right? The entire Russian system depends upon, on the one hand, claiming that Europe is decadent and gay and doomed to destruction, etc. And on the other hand, always going on vacation there, always having your bank accounts there, always having your front companies there. In other words, there's this enormous lie, this enormous hypocrisy, which actually is the thing which links intellectually or morally the Russian government with the European far right. Because the European far right is living in the same delusion. We hate Europe, but then everything that they like in their lives has to do with the existence of the European rule of law, right? And so this is the real big context, and I think this is the thing which is actually at stake. I mean, even more fundamentally than the European Union, which I think is a very fundamental thing, is the practice of the rule of law. That is what's going on here. You know, can the rule of law continue to exist, or is a certain kind of corruption going to continue to spread from Russia to Ukraine, through Bulgaria and Hungary, you know, continuing into Austria and Britain, finally reach Germany, at which point the game is over. That is one way that history could be going, right? And that is, I think, really that's really one of the fundamental stakes.
Благодаря на Тимоти Снайдер.